Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we are continuing along our journey through the book The Clean Coder by Robert C. Martin. Last time we went over just some of the introductory chapters and the prefaces and the foreword on what exactly we are going to be getting into in this book. And today we're going over officially the first chapter titled Professionalism. And we're going to talk about what it means to be a professional and how you can be a professional in this chapter. So let's just dive right in it. We'll go to the first slide. The first section of this book is Uncle Bob telling us to, be careful what we ask for. And as developers, we want to be seen as professionals. This is kind of something we talked about in the first episode. But he says that you got to be careful what you ask for, because when you want to be seen as a professional or thought of as a professional, it's going to come with a lot of other things that you might not realize. So be careful with what you ask for is kind of what he's saying. And like he says, you want it all, right? You want it all. You want to be the guy that makes a lot of money, the guy or gal that makes a lot of money, and you want to have all this stuff on your shoulders, but do you really want it? Do you really know what comes with it? Because being a professional, he says it's a loaded term. It comes with, sorry about that, it comes with the feeling of responsibility and accountability. When you view yourself as a professional, you take the utmost responsibility for your work, and you are accountable when things go wrong or not as planned. And really the difference between being a non-professional and a professional is cleaning up the mess. Non-professionals won't clean up the mess because they're not responsible for it, or they don't take accountability for it. But the professional will. So that's kind of what Uncle Bob was saying as far as being careful what you ask for. So those two principles there that we mentioned, responsibility and accountability. So being a professional means being responsible. So Uncle Bob tells this story about how he is working at this first company called Teradyne, and he needs to ship software out by a specific deadline. But in order for him to meet the deadline this one time, he fails to test the code out before shipping it. And he gets it out in time. But what he fails to discover is that there is a bug and it needs fixing. And because there's a bug, the customers end up losing some of their data, which causes a whole bunch of other issues. And it causes the customers to get mad and demand the fix, and then his boss is demanding the fix, and eventually he gets the fix in, but it takes a while. And his boss says, "Oh, you're not going to be making that mistake again, right?" So if he just would have tested it out the first time, he would have seen that there was the problem, but he didn't, because he wanted to save face. The reason for neglecting to test is because you wanted to say that you shipped it on time, right? You wanted to save face and say, "Oh, okay, I did my job." When in reality, would you rather ship it on time or not have the customers mad at you? The customers are going to get probably mad at you for not shipping on time, right? But that probably pales in comparison to, the software bugs that are present in there that are causing the customers to lose the data. So Uncle Bob says that, this was irresponsible of me to do this. I shouldn't have done this. There was no concern for the customer, and there was no concern for the employer in this situation. And really, the reason for neglecting to test was concerning my own reputation. And you didn't want your reputation to hurt because of not shipping it on time. So he says, at the end here, it's hard telling your boss something is not going to be done on time. But then it's even harder to tell your customers that, oh, there's actually a bug. So which one would you rather have? Would you rather get things done on time? Yes, obviously, we probably do want to get it done on time. But if we are starting to sacrifice other parts of our process, like checking for bugs, other sort of quality control, does that mean we ship it? Like, should we sacrifice shipping it on time for all those other things? Or should we sacrifice the quality of the product for getting it done on time? It's a small bump in the road, but ultimately, I think it's better to get things, pretty much almost, let's call it 100% right and working before getting it out there. Back and fixing it is going to be much greater. So, how should we take responsibility? Uncle Bob looks to the Hippocratic Oath for what he's about to talk to, because in the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take, you first do no harm. And he says that's something similar that should be done in software. But there's a couple different ways that we don't do harm. First, we do no harm to function, which means that we must not create bugs. And he kind of says, well, he plays out a little scenario where somebody's talking to him and saying, but, there's always going to be bugs, right? And he says, yes, there will always be bugs. But the difference is that we take responsibility for those bugs. We take responsibility for our imperfections, and that nothing's ever going to be bug or error free. And he says in these situations, you apologize, you learn from your mistakes, and you correct them. And I have a error right here that I'm sorry for. Your error rather should get to 0, so that should be rather. It's not that you're never going to make mistakes, but over time you learn from them so that you do them less and less, and your error rate should get to 0. Should get close to 0, like an asymptote to 0. So you shouldn't do any harm to function. And QA should find nothing when they test. So a lot of people use QAs as bug catchers. And Uncle Bob says that is not what QA should be. You should catch the bugs first before sending it to QA, and QA should really find nothing in their test. It's unprofessional, he says, to knowingly send faulty code to QA. So QA should find nothing. You should be the first line of defense. Now, again, before sending it to QA, you should know that it works. You should test it again and again. You should write unit tests that automate testing. And this is where he says, and I kind of get in this mode a little bit too, where I'm like, gosh, testing just takes up a lot of time. And it does if you don't have these automated steps in place where you can just, like at least for my work, if you could just run a Gradle command and run all the unit tests. And just in a few minutes, you'll find out if anything breaks. And it's not to say, and this goes along with the last bullet point too, it's not to say that there's no more rigorous testing is not needed. Because in a lot of situations it is, and your unit test can only take you so far, but it's a good first step, a good first easy, quick, reliable way to know that, okay, the code that I wrote didn't break anything. And then if it needs further testing from there, well, okay, then you can do, manual testing in a non-production environment, et cetera, et cetera. The last bullet point says it doesn't replace the need to fully test things that are mission critical. But you should have tests. You should have tests, and if code is hard to test, is it written hard to test? Because I've come across things at work where, gosh, this unit test is really difficult to cover, or this code is really difficult to cover. And is it difficult to cover because it's just written very poorly? And I've come across that, especially with if conditions where I can't it's like so hard for me to cover this one if condition. And I'm like, well, we could just rewrite this. So first, do no harm to function. And then next, we should do no harm to structure. So the structure and the design of your software. If you compromise structure, you compromise the future. So even though maybe you get the functionality working, but it might come at the cost of structure. It could be, you write something that works, but it's messy. It's all in one function. You haven't extracted or abstracted out any pieces of your code that are doing something completely different. You're sacrificing the single responsibility principle, etc. You should maintain the structure of your code. You shouldn't do harm to the structure of your code. Changes to it. So whenever you are going and making changes and writing new code in your app, those changes should be easy, and maybe easy, I would say maybe simple. It's like simple to understand, because I guess nothing's ever easy, but they should be what am I trying to say? Like, they should be understood as like a simple concept. Like, okay, we need to do this. But if the changes aren't easy and you're making all these different coding changes and it's hard to grasp what exactly you're doing within the code, and you're having to refine the design and not stick to the design principles set by your team, then maybe you need to rethink the code that you're writing. And Uncle Bob has this principle: you should always check in code that's cleaner than when you checked it out. So if you make a mess of it when you're about to check it in, should you really check that in? So something to think about. At the end of it, he says, code should be continuously shaped and molded like clay. It should always be trying to be continuously improved upon, rewritten possibly. But at the end of the day, do no harm to function and do no harm to structure in your code. That's at the basis of being a professional software developer. So what about your work ethic? So your career is your responsibility. This was something I remember when I first started at my company. This was something that the HR rep, who's a really great guy, and he's not at the company anymore, but he talked about, your career is your journey. Like, we're going to kind of like give you some tools here and there, but ultimately you need to be the leader. You need to be in the driver's seat of your career. That's your responsibility. And that's what Uncle Bob says too in this section. And he says, when you're at work, you should be working. If you're dedicating 40 hours a week to your employer, he says, dedicate 20 hours to your continuous learning, which is going to help your employer by you learning new skill sets and being up to date on new technologies, etc. But it's not necessarily for your employer. It's for you and your career. This should be something personal to you, because he says ultimately professionals spend time caring for their profession. You should be willing to learn, like I said, new languages, new tech stacks, new trends in the industry. Something, I'll be honest with you guys, something I struggle with. Like, I don't really keep up to date with certain things. I mean, I try, and I guess that's what I'm trying to do maybe with these videos, but this is something I struggle with, is trying to find time to, hone my craft. And I do feel like I could be doing a lot better in this area, is offered through my company. So trying to go through that. But at the end of the day, professionals spend time caring for their profession. Next, professionals know their field. So Uncle Bob says that you should know a sizable chunk of ideas, disciplines, tools, and terminologies in your field. And I wrote something here that you need to know the past so that you can know the future. And so software development and how it was done back in the day, and comparing that to what it is now to know possibly where it's going in the future. And really simple stuff, guys, like understanding like how does a computer work? The like bits, the bytes aspect, you know, all of that stuff. Because I think it would help in my, not to know it like word for word, but just understanding like how we got to where we were today. Uncle Bob says here, though, that even though some stuff is archaic, like obviously computers have changed, programming languages have changed, but there's also some stuff that hasn't changed. Like we're still writing if and while loops, like relatively the same as, or we've been writing them kind of the same for a while. Some ideas stay relevant, but it's important to know why some ideas fell out of relevance. Like, for example, the waterfall method versus, you know, now everything's like all agile and Scrum. You know, why did waterfall fall out of favor? And can we understand that there was some good aspects to waterfall and some bad aspects to it? Ultimately, he writes these different topics that are going to be good to understand for a software developer. You should understand the design patterns, principles, methods. And as far as methods, he means you should understand XP, Scrum, Lean, Kanban, Waterfall, structure analysis, and structure design. So that's kind of what he means by methods. You should understand disciplines like test-driven development, object-oriented design, CI/CD. You should understand artifacts like UML, structure charts, Petri nets, etc. So know your field, know everything outside of what you do as a software developer, you know, typing away Java code in an IDE. Understand the larger scope of things. And yeah, continuous learning, because why should employers hire developers who don't keep current? Would you hire a doctor who's not current on all the medical journals? And that kind of hit me hard. I was like, whoa, I didn't think about it like that. And yeah, I think it's important to stay current because things change on a whim. And it's important to, you know, read, Uncle Bob says, read books, articles, blogs, again, another spelling error, tweets, you know, just so you understand the gist of what's going on in your industry. You know, go to conferences, go to user groups and talk to people, understand, again, the trends, where are things going, what's good to know, what's not good to know, etc. And practice, practice, practice. True professionals work hard to keep their skills sharp. And this was something that I started to do, and I got away from this a long time ago, was starting off the day with like a coding exercise, you know, doing these little kata exercise. I think there's a website called Code Kata, I think is what it's called, but you just train your fingers and your brain. You do like a 10-minute warm up in the morning, 10-minute cool down at the end of the day. It's like, it's an exercise. Yeah. You're exercising your brain. But Uncle Bob says, you know, when you do your daily job, that's performance. That's not practice. And in practicing, you're refining and enhancing. When you're in your job, you're just performing. If you guys remember, I did a book called With Winning in Mind, and we talked about how when you go out there and you perform, it should be you reaching back into your subconscious self and extracting the skill sets that you learned. And it shouldn't be anything that you have to like really think about. Like when you are an archer, you've practiced pulling the bow from your quiver and shooting it so many times that it's subconscious. You just do it, right? You just do it in the moment. And if you don't perform well that day, well, then you go back and you try to refine your methods and your process and your skill in practice. And I like that Uncle Bob said this here. That's kind of what it made me think about was Lanny Basham's book, again, With Winning in Mind. And we did a video series on that if you guys want to check it out. But yeah, professionals practice. You got to keep your skills sharp. Professionals collaborate, program together, pair programming. Somebody's driving, somebody's navigating. I really like pair programming. And then you switch off too. So then the other person is driving and you switch roles. Collaboration also is also part of mentoring. And the best way to learn is to teach others. And professionals should take responsibility for mentoring others, mentoring junior developers and, passing on the knowledge, maybe from the clean coder or clean code, passing on the knowledge to other people so that they don't make the same mistakes. We're going to talk about this in a second, but you shouldn't laugh, or you shouldn't make fun, or you shouldn't judge juniors developers on making mistakes, because you probably made those same mistakes, but also there might come a day where you make a mistake on a different level and it wouldn't look good. You don't judge anybody for that. So that's a part of being a professional too. And like I said, know your domain. Or actually, no, not like I said, because we haven't talked about this yet. But whatever industry you're programming for, you should know that industry a little bit. For me, working in programming for a supply chain company, you should know a little bit about supply chain. And I definitely have learned a lot on the job, but another area I could be a little bit better on in trying to understand supply chain management. Like if you're working for an accounting firm, programming a new mobile app for them, you should know a little bit about accounting and understand essentially the business sense of what you're doing. Last slide, guys. You should identify with your employer or customer. Your employer's problems are your problems. And like we said, part of being a professional is taking responsibility. So are you taking responsibility for the problems at your employer that your employer has, and are the solutions that you code actually solving and fixing and giving your employers what they need? Ultimately, Uncle Bob is saying here, it's easy to get into an us versus them mentality when you're a developer. This is kind of the story that we talked about in the introduction video episode where, there was everybody else. There was like the business people who were professionals. And then there's the development team who are not seen as professionals. But it's easy to get into like, oh, we're devs. We're just going to band together, and what we do, like we dictate what we code. Like we know what's best for this app. And it's not a healthy thing to do. It's not healthy to have an us versus them mentality within the company. Everybody should be working together. And yeah, I think about like, okay, like we can have the responsibility to make changes on how we view the relationship, but the other person would have to too. So maybe that would take some extra work on their part, like to meet you halfway a little bit. Lastly, humility. When we program, we create something out of nothing. And as a professional, you have to be bold and confident when you're creating new things. But there's going to be times where you're wrong. And you have to kind of step back and be the first to laugh at yourself. And like I said, not at others. You have to be the first one to say, oh, my bad. Like my fault. That wasn't right. And again, that's where you correct your mistake and you try to make it less and less over time to the point where it's close to zero times that you're making that mistake. So you want to be confident But you want to recognize the times where you're wrong, and you need to be humble a little bit on what you know and what you don't know and what you don't even know that you don't know. And that's going to do it for chapter 1, guys, on being a professional. Remember, do no harm to function and do no harm to structure. Take responsibility and accountability. Your career is yours. You shouldn't expect anybody else to mold it for you. You should be continuously learning, continuously practicing. You should be humble a little bit. If I had to just spit out some main points from this chapter. Guys, thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next time with chapter 2. A little Seinfeld reference for you guys there, if you guys watch Seinfeld. But thank you guys very much for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.